Aida by Giuseppe Verdi. Verdi's grandest opera, Aida, has been described as a chamber opera with a parade marching through the middle of it. That's because while Aida is properly thought of as a very grand opera indeed, it is basically about three people, the eternal triangle. But Aida is also the most celebrated, maybe the best-loved opera that even Verdi ever wrote. I say even Verdi because no composer in history so completely captured the mood of a nation and the hearts of a people as did Papa Verdi in 19th century Italy. No one more consistently provided his compatriots for the best part of a century with supreme examples of their beloved art form than the self-styled peasant from Roncalli near Milan, whose career ran from the age of the bel canto in the early part of the 19th century right up to the dawn of the 20th. Just to name half a dozen of Verdi's greatest hits is to make a roll call of some of the great operas of all time: Rigoletto, Il Trovatore, La Traviata, and, of course, Aida. But as we find with so many of the great composers, the truth is more complex than a list of hits. We need to go back to Verdi's earliest days and learn a bit about his richly varied career to appreciate the complexities of a piece like Aida and get a sense of its place not just in musical history, but in the political history of Italy. It seems there is only one date in 19th century opera which we need to remember, and that is 1813, because in that year Verdi was born just south of the Alps and Wagner just north of them. And these two giants would bestride the world of 19th century opera like twin colossi. Twins, that is, in their importance and impact, because in no other way did they resemble each other. Verdi liked to claim that he came from peasant roots, but in fact his background was more what would have been called lower middle class. Young Giuseppe received a decent education, but notoriously was forbidden admission to the music conservatory in Milan because he lacked entrance qualifications. It was fashionable for a long time to divide Verdi's great career into three parts, and although some critics now choose instead to see it as a single and unbroken progression, you and I might find it convenient to regard this 60-year span as follows. First, there was the period which Verdi himself described as his galley slave years, because he was churning out one opera a year for the apparently insatiable Italian opera market. Operas like Ernani and Macbeth. These operas of his early years are marked by an amazing melodic richness, by a driving energy. At one time they were looked down on, but it is wonderful that in the last 20 years we have come to see them as supreme examples of a very rich, if occasionally naive, period in operatic development. They are also politically very important, of which more later. Next, and not surprisingly, comes the middle period, which produced all those marvellously tuneful works, some of which we have mentioned before: Rigoletto, Il Trovatore, La Traviata. And these established Verdi's fame and fortune as the leading composer of his day. It is easy and convenient to think of Aida as the climax and complete summation of this period, and indeed of a long and brilliant career in the theatre. Not at all, because Verdi surprised the world and to this day amazes us with two final operas written in his 70s and 80s, Otello and Falstaff, which are respectively the greatest tragedy and the greatest comedy ever written for the Italian opera stage. What a man! But before we get into too much detail on Aida, we need to talk politics for a while. When Verdi was born in 1813, Italy was, in Metternich's notorious phrase, only a geographical expression. It was a collection of states, some independent, some under the heel of the Austrian Empire, with a great swathe across the middle of the country which was called the Papal States, where the Pope ruled one of the most repressive regimes on earth. Long before Verdi died in 1900, Italy was a united country. Foreign occupiers had been ejected, and the Pope's earthly realm reduced to 200 acres across the Tiber from downtown Rome to a suburb state called the Vatican. Verdi played a role in all this. The Italian movement towards national unity was the Risorgimento, and the plan was to unite the country under the benevolent rule of King Victor Emmanuel of Piedmont. The prime movers were Mazzini and Cavour on the political front, with, of course, the warrior Garibaldi literally leading the charge. Verdi would provide the musical propaganda. When Nabucco had its premiere and the chorus of Hebrew slaves sang the exquisite Va Pensiero from out of the depths of their Babylonian captivity, every Italian in the audience thought only of the Austrian domination of their country and of the longing for freedom that wonderful tune captures. When Verdi wrote his scathing portrait of the arrogant aristocrat the Duke of Mantua in Rigoletto, his audience understood that Verdi was making a political statement on the corrupting influence of autocracy. The anti-hero of that opera was originally a king, until the Austrian censors, the bane of Verdi's early career, made him soften the political effect by substituting a duke for a crowned head. And when Verdi made the priests the real villains of Aida, cruel and judgmental, he was making an anti-clerical comment that would have escaped no one in the audience, as the tyranny of the Papal States was only then being reduced from a political to a spiritual power. Verdi's Aida virtually defines grand opera for most people, so it is only to be expected, as one of those intriguing paradoxes, that it really doesn't qualify. For a start, the expression grand opera is really French, grande opéra, and refers to those majestic and cumbersome works which were written for the Paris Opera, a theatre which Verdi disparaged as la grande boutique, the big shop. Secondly, Aida is, of course, in Italian, and thirdly, it has more intimate scenes than it does large ones. However, with its spectacular tunes, huge sets, and alas often costumes, vast crowd scenes, temples, grand march, animals, slaves, trophies, and war chariots, it has it all. The belief is that it was written to celebrate the opening of the Suez Canal, which is almost correct. The canal opened in 1869, and with it the Cairo Opera House. The Khedive of Egypt had been trying to get Verdi, the most popular, highest-regarded composer of his day, to write an opera for the opening of the new house, and Verdi refused. So the house opened with one of his earlier pieces, Rigoletto. But Verdi was not entirely uninterested, and given the fairly cool reception received by his last two grand operas for Paris, Don Carlo and the Sicilian Vespers, he was probably grateful for what trial lawyers call a change of venue. Eventually, through intermediaries and emissaries, Verdi was sent a scenario, a treatment, as they would say in Hollywood, of an opera based on Egyptian themes. Verdi was always on the lookout for good subjects which offered him dramatic opportunities, great characters, conflict of emotions, real as opposed to contrived dramatic tension. In the end, what decided Verdi to write the opera Aida was probably the combination of a great story and an exotic location. We think we know pretty much all that we need to know about ancient Egypt, what it looked like and even what it sounded like. But probably the two greatest components of our knowledge are the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun, which lay many decades in the future, as Verdi wrote, and Aida itself, which for many practically defines ancient Egyptian culture. And no wonder, because Verdi went to extraordinary lengths to learn all he could about Egyptian manners, clothes, what sort of instruments they played, their dances, and their religious rites. And he brilliantly wove all this into a story which is deeply touching and emotionally complex. So if all you know about Aida is the Grand March, I hope you will be surprised and in the end enchanted by the number of times words like subtlety and gentle emotion creep into this presentation. Let's begin with the prelude, and with it the concept of leitmotif or signature tunes. This is the idea of having a tune represent a person or an emotion or a place. There's nothing unusual about them. They're as old as Mozart, and composers as dissimilar as Wagner and Sir Arthur Sullivan used them. But Verdi made very special use of them in Aida. There is the gently pensive and expressive theme for Aida, the martial, manly melody of Radames, the sultry, aristocratic, almost sinuous theme for Amneris, the other woman. The prelude opens then, very properly, with the statement of the theme for Aida herself. Quite right, too, as she is the title role. It's a gorgeous, rising melody, warm, sensual, in which you can hear all the longing in Aida's heart. The next tune in the prelude represents the priests, stern, unyielding, and possessed of a grave dignity. A word about the situation at the opening of the opera. Aida is an Egyptian slave, a captive in the service of Amneris, Princess of Egypt. She is, as we know, but Amneris doesn't, also a princess. Aida's father is Amonasro, the warrior king of Ethiopia, who is threatening the southern borders of Egypt. Aida loves Radames, a young officer in the Egyptian army, and he is nuts about her. Unfortunately, Amneris, the haughty princess of Egypt, daughter of the pharaoh, also has a crush on Radames. So you have the basis of a deadly and eternal triangle. One man, Radames, loved by two women, the slave girl Aida and the boss's daughter. As the curtain rises in the pharaoh's palace in Memphis, that's Memphis, Egypt, the high priest Ramphis tells Radames, and us, of course, that the Ethiopians are making trouble again, and that someone will be chosen to lead the Egyptian army against the enemy. Right away we have the seeds of the conflict between public duty and private desires, as Radames says first how much he would love to be chosen to lead the army, and then launches into a superb song of praise for his heavenly Aida, Celeste Aida. It, too, is a ravishing tune, and the graveyard of many a tenor. It is cruel and surprising that Verdi should have given this killer aria to the tenor some 61 seconds into the opera, before he has had time to gargle and warm up. But there it is. Listen to this glorious melody. He has an agitated middle section to the aria in which he says how he will restore Aida to her native land and free her from slavery. Let's hear that. And Radames concludes his killer aria with a slow, inexorable climb to a high B flat, which has defeated many a tenor, and called down the derision of the house, as Italian audiences like to state their position on singers at the earliest opportunity. You'll notice Verdi adds to the tenor's problems by demanding a diminuendo. That's a gradual reduction in volume on the high note. Deadly difficult in the theatre, easier in the recording studio, where the man in the control booth can achieve wonders, and often does. The Princess Amneris now enters, preceded by her signature tune, that marvellously aristocratic but sinuous melody I referred to earlier. Having overheard Radames' song of delight, she asks if he might be in love. Aida now comes in to complete the triangle. And in this short scene, Amneris suspects that Aida may be her rival for the love of Radames. She turns all cajoling and says she thinks of Aida more as a sister than as a slave, recalling Oscar Wilde's line that women never call each other sister until they have called each other many other things first. Listen for Aida's melody, then Amneris' suspicions, and then hear Amneris come over all cajoling as she patronizes Aida. The recurring theme of this opera, and one that we have become very aware of in our own recent political lives, is how love, or at least lust, can intrude into public life. And after a stormy confrontation among these three, the king, as the pharaoh is usually called, comes into some very kingly music. A messenger reports that the Ethiopians are revolting again, and the king announces the appointment of the new general of the army. Hands up, all who guessed, Radames. The king leads us in a warlike chorus, which is the beginning of a scene finale which almost rivals the Grand March in splendour. Here's the martial monarch. A component in this scene is the warlike disposition of the crowd, and of course none are more belligerent than the priests. So it is not surprising, if you know Verdi's low opinion of the clergy, to hear the priests lead the shout of Guerra, war. Guerra, 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 Terrific stuff. You hear me talk a lot about the conflict, the contrast between public and private life in this opera, and here it is brilliantly encapsulated. Amneris, the pharaoh's warlike daughter, calls out to Radames, "Return as victor! Ritorna vincitor!" And it is crucial we remember that phrase in all the patriotic melee that follows. Ritorna vincitor! That phrase, ritorna vincitor, return victorious, is taken up by Aida, left alone after the troops have marched off. She repeats Amneris's phrase, but for her it has a special and dreadful double meaning. On the one hand, she wishes her lover well, but, we recall, she is the daughter of Amonasro, the warrior king against whom the army has been sent.
Vincitor del padre mio, d'eroi che magnorarmi per me, ed di donarmi una patria, una reggia, il nome illustri che qui celarmi forza. Vincitor dei miei fratelli.
In the lovely but agitated middle section of the aria, she ponders her awful dilemma. I sacri nomi. The sacred names of father and lover are confused in my mind. In other words, which to support, as the success of one would mean defeat, maybe death, for the other. And not for the last time in this opera, a scene which has scaled the Olympian heights of grand operatic grandeur ends with one slave girl alone on stage asking the gods for pity. Numi pietà, she sings. May the gods have mercy. The next scene takes us back into the public arena for the sacramental blessing of the weapons, and we'll hear just two incidents. After a great deal of coochie-coo atmospheric stuff from the priestly class, we have Ramphis' glorious hymn, Numi Custode. Great God and Guardian, let your hand protect Egypt's soil, an excellent sentiment taken up by Radames and the priests. This great public scene ends with a huge shout of immenso ta, ta being the name of the god in question. First Radames and Ramphis, immenso ta, then the assembled. Immenso ta! The second act opens with another private scene, set in Amneris' apartment in the palace. The scene opens with more atmospheric singing from the chorus, with which we shall not concern ourselves, and a lengthy ballet, with which we shall certainly not concern ourselves. And then we have the scene which may be the emotional core of the opera. In it, Amneris will trick Aida into admitting that she loves Radames. First, let's hear the seductive and persuasive music as Amneris tries to lure Aida into confessing her love for Radames. Next, let's hear Aida plead for mercy and understanding from a woman severely scorned, and Amneris' furious denunciation of the slave girl who has won the heart of Radames, thereby insulting Amneris as a woman and as a princess.
Tu sei Prima mi schiava stezza il tuo cuore, segno tuo morte, questo amore, del quale schiena, arbitra la suona,
Again, the public intrudes upon the private. Let's hear how that works. While Amneris is raging at Aida, the offstage chorus announces the outcome of war. We now come to the most famous, the most notorious even scene in this or maybe any grand opera. The grand and triumphal scene. So much happens dramatically in this scene that we can lose sight of it under the weight of elephants, supers, spear carriers, slaves, and what Julius Caesar used to call the impedimenta. So here's a thumbnail sketch of the action. The court assembles. The Ethiopian slaves are led in. Aida will recognize her father, though his identity of warrior-king is kept secret. Radames will enter in triumph. The good people of the cast will ask for mercy for the slaves. The bad people, you've guessed it, the priests, will ask for death. And Radames will be rewarded for his victory with the hand of the Princess Amneris in marriage, thereby guaranteeing him the succession to the throne. Public rejoicing, private disaster. So let's try to keep these plot strands in mind as we work our way through this marvellous scene. Some people, musicologists and the sillier type of critic, have derided this scene as pomp without circumstance, or to borrow another insult, effects without cause. But that is nonsense. The fact people love this scene does not make it any less of a triumph for Verdi, one of those vast architectonic finales of which he was such a master. There are similarly great Scena finales in Traviata and Otello, and a less good one in Don Carlo. Verdi reinvented these trumpets, and they are now called Aida trumpets. Listen as their martial blast brilliantly whets our excitement for the march to follow. We're children again, and the circus is coming. Then listen as the chorus blasts forth like a burst of sunshine with Gloria el Egitto, glory to Egypt. Then comes the Grand March. Hackneyed? Absolutely not. The Reverend Sidney Smith said Paradise was eating pâté de foie gras to the sound of trumpets, and even without the pâté, this scene is heaven. The excitement, as the sportscasters would say, approaches fever pitch as Radames enters. Sometimes borne aloft on shields, sometimes in a chariot, and once at the baths of Caracalla in a quadriga, a glorious war chariot drawn by 4 white horses, which gallops from the back of that vast auditorium right to the footlights before rising to pour in the air. You could almost hear the pop of the tourist flashbulbs at the climax to the entrance of Radames. Of course, good news for the Egyptians is bad news for the Ethiopians, and we have the sad and dejected entrance of the Ethiopian captives. Given Verdi's sympathy with oppressed peoples, including his own, it is easy to hear how he puts all the feelings of a warm Italian heart into this music. Next, we have the incident where Aida recognizes her father among the captives. We all do, but we keep his secret as he appeals to the Pharaoh to spare his people. The good souls join in with him. The baddies, led by the priests, protest such soft-heartedness. Pharaoh has promised Radames any wish in recognition of his victory, and he asks for the release of the captives. Pharaoh grants this with 2 conditions: that Aida and her father remain in Egypt as security, and that Radames takes the hand of Amneris in marriage, guaranteeing the succession. Triumph for Amneris, Triumph for the Egyptians. Bad news for Aida and Radames, and the scene ends, after many asides as the principal characters express their emotions, with closing pages as grandly sweeping as anything in the whole world of opera. Act 3 now follows, and it is set on the banks of the Nile. In the course of it, Radames will be coerced by Aida into revealing a state secret, while her father listens in, and Radames will be arrested for treason. This scene is as intensely dark and personal and introspective as the last one was public and blazing. I want to play you 59 seconds of the orchestral introduction to this act, because it is so very unusual. Anyone who still thinks of Verdi as a gifted tunesmith and of Aida as tourist fodder needs to listen to this amazing orchestral writing. It is a starry, brightly moonlit night. Verdi's orchestral introduction depicts all this with flute solo and strings, a miracle of atmospheric loveliness and restraint, 4 octaves of staccato G on muted violins, glassy harmonics for the cellos, muted violas, shimmering tremolos for the second violins, upon which the flute dips and sways. Wow! Here is that impressionist canvas in music. The scene opens with Amneris being escorted to the temple of Isis, where she will spend the night in prayer before her marriage to Radames. Aida enters, and has her second great aria, the O Patria Mia, a great hymn of nostalgia and patriotic longing, which, of course, would then, and still will now, resonate very deeply with Italians, whether labouring under a yoke of occupation or in exile. Let's hear the exquisite phrase on the oboe which sets up the words, O Patria Mia, O my homeland. Like many of Verdi aria, this one is in 3 parts, the middle part here being a more agitated, more impassioned recollection of the simple joys of her childhood, and the azure skies of home, O cieli azzurri. And the wonderful aria ends with a firmer, more impassioned statement of the lovely O Patria Mia, O my homeland theme. We have another now of these 2-person scenes, which justify the description of Aida as basically a small-scale piece, with a circus appearing from time to time. Aida's father, the warrior king of the Ethiopians, Amonasro, now approaches Aida and demands that she find out from Radames a state secret, to wit, the route that the Egyptian army will take on its next sortie, so that he may ambush and destroy it. Again, Aida is faced with one of those public duty, private wish dilemmas, which seem to be her lot in life. When she appears reluctant, her father flies into a rage. Well, Papa pushes off, and not before time, because Radames enters and Aida uses all her warmth of personality and Verdi's fullest melodic resources to persuade him that they should flee Egypt together and seek a new homeland. But Radames has his loyalties to his homeland, Egypt, and this conflict is exquisitely expressed in their love duet. We've time for only a few phrases of it. Well, events move swiftly to the end of the act, as Aida has Radames tell her which escape route they must take to avoid the troops, and, of course, the listening Amonasro learns the secret he desires. Amneris, coming out of the temple on cue, hears all this and pronounces Radames a traitor. Radames willingly offers himself for arrest, allowing Aida and her father to escape. The last act, Act 4, is in 2 scenes, the Judgment Hall and the inevitable death scene. But, of course, with Verdi, nothing is completely inevitable, and even the death scene, as we shall see, has a twist to it. Radames is led in from his dungeon on the way to trial, and encounters Amneris, who curses that her rival Aida has escaped her clutches. In this, another of the great two-person confrontation scenes, which, as I keep saying, are the real meat of this opera, Amneris tries to persuade Radames to exculpate himself. Near enough in Italian, scolpati. You'll hear her sing this. And Verdi gives Radames another manly, sinuous tune as he sings how he betrayed the state secret unconsciously, but will not offer any defence. Scolpati, she sings. But he refuses. This duet between Radames and Amneris, she alternately pleading and raging, he alternately tender in recollection of Aida, angry in his defiance, is the real stuff of grand opera. It is these monumental personal confrontations, rather than the pomp and parades, which live in the memory after a really good performance of Aida. Here is a last sample of the duet, and listen especially to the terrific music Verdi gives to the orchestra as Radames is led off to trial. Terrifying, full of menace, trembling with Amneris's rage, and see if you don't hear a trembling, frustrated quality of a woman used to her own way, frustrated and furious at the needless loss of her lover. Here is a sample of the power and grandeur, and again the juxtaposition of the public and the private, in the immensely powerful trial, usually called the judgment scene. The first voice you will hear is Ramphis, the high priest, accusing Radames of divulging a state secret. Then the priests, I hesitate to say Inquisition, though that's a bell that would have rung in a few heads at the first performance, then the priests saying, Disculpati, defend yourself. Then Ramphis, Elietace. He is silent. The priest's cry of Traditor, and an overwhelming outpouring of anguish from Amneris, of the gods have pity variety. Here it is, the judgment scene.
Radames, Radames, Radames. Della patria i segreti allo straniero. Discolpati, discolpati.
Well, it's all over, bar the protracted death scene, mandatory in any 19th century opera. And here the protraction is medically justified, as Radames has been condemned to be buried alive. As they say in the Mikado, it's such a stuffy death. Act 4, Scene 2, for such it is, has a wonderful theatrical device of a split-level stage. Below is the crypt to which Radames has been condemned, and above it is the temple of Vulcan. This allows Verdi the superb dramatic opportunity of depicting the events below, while Amneris, the survivor, comments above. It's a superb theatrical notion, as we shall hear. I could have said that Amneris is the sole survivor of the Eternal Triangle, because at the top of the scene we discover that Aida, far from having fled to safety with her papa, has learned of the fate of Radames and crept into the crypt. So this final scene will comprise a duet for the lovers, while the woman scorned mourns her loss from the temple above. Great stuff. Here is a short passage in which Aida tells us that she has chosen to die with Radames. Gloomy, sepulchral, but also deeply tender. Radames's reaction is equally and deeply tender as he sings Morir si pure e bella, to die so pure and beautiful. And Verdi gives this warrior a ravishing, almost angelic melody as he addresses his lover in their last hours. And before you condemn either the sentiment or the melody as sentimental, remember that in Victorian times child and youthful deaths were more common. Mortality was somehow a more present aspect of youthfulness than it is today, and many in the audiences of the day no doubt had lost someone. Si pure e bella. You may not be a great fan of long death scenes, but this one is a beauty. The two lovers bid farewell to the world in the exquisite duet O Terra Addio, which I played at the beginning of this programme. If you have ever attended a performance at the Baths of Caracalla or the Arena di Verona, you will have your own memories of this enchanting melody floating out over the scented Mediterranean air under a black canopy of stars, with the umbrella pines cunningly lit, and the only distraction the tourists battling to get out and be first on the bus. So here, without such distractions, is one of the loveliest melodies even Verdi ever wrote. And this most public, this grandest of all grand operas, ends not with a bang, but with a whisper. Radames and Aida continue that lovely tune, O Terra Addio. Amneris, literally overhead, calls for peace and forgiveness for her lost lover, and reminds us that there are worse fates in life than dying. There is surviving, being left behind, as it were. And, as so often, the last word is given to the priestly class, who quietly intone Immenso Fata, a benediction from the gods.
pace t'imploro.
Well, there you have it. One of the 3 most popular operas ever written, along with La Bohème and Carmen. A sumptuous work, which has moments of great drama, moments of unrivalled spectacle and majesty, but which reminds us in the last moments that it's all about people, and the greatest love affairs and the greatest affairs of state distill themselves in simple humanity. And no one does simple humanity better than the best-loved of all Italian composers, Giuseppe Verdi.